Simone Gray had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being invisible in Silas Vane's glass and steel penthouse. She knew the exact pressure required to buff the mahogany desk and which floorboards in the gallery groaned under weight, details she understood better than the layout of her own studio apartment. She lived by a simple code: eyes down, hands busy, ears closed. In a world where men in charcoal suits carried silenced pistols like fashion accessories, curiosity was a death sentence. Her life was a rhythmic loop of bleach, silent corridors, and a steady paycheck. That Tuesday followed the usual script. Simone was polishing the floor-to-ceiling windows of the primary suite when Silas Vane strode past. He didn't look at her. To him, she was just another high-end appliance. He was barking into an encrypted phone, his voice a low growl as he mentioned a breach in the southern docks, and a name that made the air turn cold: Varga. Simone kept her cloth moving in steady circles, but her pulse thrummed. She knew that tone. It was the sound of a man who didn't realize the sharks had already found the blood in the water. By 8 p.m., the penthouse was bathed in the cold blue glow of the city skyline. Simone was in the kitchen, the soft clink of silverware the only sound in the cavernous space. Then the silence shattered. The alarm didn't just ring. It shrieked, a high-pitched mechanical scream that triggered the emergency crimson floods along the baseboards. Most people would have frozen. The rest of the staff scrambled for the service stairs in a panic. But as Simone dropped her cleaning cloth, the maid vanished. Her spine straightened, her gaze turned predatory, and her breath slowed to a combat rhythm. She didn't run for the exit. She sprinted toward the master study. With a strength that defied her slight frame, she wrenched back the heavy velvet tapestry, revealing the cold titanium face of the panic room. Her fingers danced over the keypad, entering a code she was never supposed to have, and the vault door hissed open. The sun rose over the city like a slow bleed, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows. Simone Gray was already there, moving through the silence of the 58th floor with the practiced grace of a phantom. In this house, silence wasn't just a preference. It was a currency. She began her morning in the gallery, her movements rhythmic and precise. To anyone watching, she was merely a woman in a crisp black uniform buffing the glass cases that housed ancient artifacts. But Simone wasn't just cleaning, she was cataloging. Every time she wiped the obsidian surface of a Mayan blade, she noted the angle of the security cameras. Every time she polished the marble floors, she felt the slight vibration of the elevator, the only warning that someone was coming. She knew the weight of the guards' footsteps, could distinguish the heavy tread of the veterans from the nervous, lighter tap of the new recruits. In her 2 years here, Simone had learned that power wasn't just about who held the gun. It was about who held the information. And no one held more information than the woman everyone forgot was in the room. By mid-morning, she moved toward the primary study, the inner sanctum of Silas Vane's empire. The air here was thicker, smelling of expensive tobacco and old secrets. Silas was already at his desk, a man carved from granite and ambition. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't even pause his conversation. To him, Simone was part of the furniture, as reliable as his desk and just as incapable of speech. "I don't care what the cost is," Silas growled into his phone, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. He was staring out at the skyline, his back to her. "If Lucian Varga thinks he can squeeze my operations in the harbor, he's delusional. The man is a scavenger. He waits for a scent of weakness, then he strikes. I want him neutralized before he even crosses the city limits." Simone moved closer, her cloth circling a silver tray on the sideboard. She didn't let her hand shake, but the name Varga hit her like a physical blow. She knew that name. It was a name whispered in the dark corners of the world she had tried to leave behind, a name associated with surgical strikes and a complete lack of mercy. Silas turned, his gaze sweeping over her without a hint of recognition. "The SETI deal is falling apart because of him," he continued, pacing the length of the office. "Varga doesn't play by the old rules. He's looking for a way in, a crack in the foundation. Find it before he does. He hung up the phone and threw it onto the leather-topped desk, finally noticing Simone as she reached for a stray crystal glass. For a fleeting second, his eyes met hers. Most people saw a quiet, middle-aged maid with tired eyes and a bent back. Silas saw even less, a servant whose only value was her utility. "Fresh coffee, Simone," he ordered, his tone absent, already turning back to a stack of digital tablets. "And make sure the library is locked when you're done. I have guests arriving at midnight who aren't on the official manifest." "Yes, Mr. Vane," she murmured, her voice a soft, unremarkable hum. As she walked toward the kitchen, Simone felt the familiar itch between her shoulder blades, the instinct that had kept her alive during her years in the field. Silas thought he was the hunter, worried about harbor docks and city limits. He didn't realize that Varga wouldn't attack the edges of the empire first. Varga was a predator who went straight for the throat. She poured the coffee, the steam rising to meet her stoic face. She looked at her reflection in the stainless steel of the espresso machine. The maid stared back, but behind those eyes, the soldier was already calculating the distance between the kitchen knives and the hidden tactical kit she had tucked behind the pantry wall months ago. Silas Vane thought he was protected by steel and sensors. He had no idea that his only real defense was the woman currently stirring cream into his cup. The transition from evening tranquility to total warfare happened in the heartbeat between two breaths. Simone was in the dining hall, moving a silk cloth over the long mahogany table, when the world turned blood-red. The emergency lights didn't just flicker on. They pulsed with a rhythmic, violent intensity that stained the white marble floors like fresh arterial spray. There was no siren yet, only the heavy, pressurized thud of the penthouse's air filtration system shutting down to prevent gas infiltration. It was the sound of a tomb sealing shut. Simone didn't flinch. She didn't drop her polishing cloth. She simply placed it neatly on the table, her gaze snapping to the hallway. Her peripheral vision caught the shadow of a security guard passing the frosted glass doors of the terrace. He didn't make it across. A muffled crack, the distinct dry snap of a suppressed subsonic round, stole his life before he could even reach for his radio. He slumped against the glass, leaving a long, dark streak as he slid out of sight. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. The professionals had arrived. Simone moved. She didn't run with the frantic, heavy steps of a panicked servant. She drifted through the shadows of the corridor with a predatory silence that would have terrified Silas Vane had he seen it. She bypassed the main elevators, knowing they were already compromised, and cut through the service pantry. She found Silas in the center of his grand library, the very room she had been dusting hours before. He was standing behind his desk, a heavy silver revolver in his hand, but his face was a mask of uncharacteristic hesitation. He was a man used to giving orders from a throne, not fighting in the trenches. He was staring at the security monitors on his desk, which were flickering to static one by one as the intruders cut the feeds. "Mr. Vane," Simone said. Her voice was no longer the soft, subservient hum he was used to. It was clipped, resonant, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Silas spun around, his weapon shaking slightly as he aimed it at her chest. "Simone, what the hell are you doing? Get to the basement with the others." Simone didn't stop walking toward him. She didn't look at the gun. Her eyes were fixed on the door behind him. "Put the weapon down, Silas. You're going to trip the seer and shoot the floor, and we don't have time for accidents." Silas froze, the sheer coldness of her tone pinning him in place. "How do you?" "Quiet," she commanded, and the word hit him like a physical blow. She reached him in 3 long strides, her hand moving with a speed he couldn't track to gently but firmly lower the barrel of his revolver. She looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in 2 years, Silas Vane actually saw the woman who had been cleaning his floors. He saw a soldier who had looked into the abyss and didn't blink. They've bypassed the perimeter guards. 2 teams, 6 men total. They're using suppressed HK416S and they're moving in a staggered diamond formation, she said, her voice a low, lethal whisper. The service stairs are gone. The elevator is a kill box. Silas stared at her, his mouth slightly open, the power dynamic of the penthouse shifting so violently it made his head spin. Who are you? The person keeping you alive for the next 10 minutes, Simone replied. She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed his shoulder, her grip like iron, and began navigating him toward the hidden bookcase. Move. Low profile. Keep your weight on the balls of your feet. If you hear a shot, you drop and you stay down. Do not breathe until I tell you. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a tactical directive. As the sound of the front door being breached echoed through the vents, a dull metallic boom, Silas Vane realized that the only person in the room who knew how to survive was the woman he had treated as a ghost. Simone wasn't hiding from the red light. She was the only thing standing between him and the darkness it heralded. The heavy bookcase glided aside with a mechanical hum that was nearly swallowed by the rhythmic thumping of heavy boots in the outer corridor. Silas Vane, a man who had spent a lifetime dictating the fate of others, found himself being steered like a novice by the woman he had once considered background noise. Simone's hand was firm on his shoulder, her movements devoid of the hesitation that usually accompanied a maid's deference. She punched the 18-digit sequence into the keypad with a blur of fingers. The titanium door of the panic room hissed open, revealing a sterile, cold sanctuary lit by the blue glow of a dozen high-definition monitors. Get in. Now, Simone commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum delivered with the icy precision of a firing squad. Silas stumbled into the small reinforced room, the air inside smelling of ozone and filtered oxygen. He turned back immediately, his hand catching the edge of the heavy door. Simone, get inside. There's enough air for 2 weeks. If Vargas people are in the hallway, you won't last 10 seconds out there. Simone stood on the threshold, the crimson emergency lights of the penthouse reflecting in her dark, unblinking eyes. She didn't move toward the safety of the vault. Instead, she reached into the hidden recesses of her black uniform, her hand disappearing into a slit in the fabric he had never noticed. When it emerged, she was holding a matte black semi-automatic with a proficiency that made Silas's blood run cold. She checked the magazine and racked the slide in a single fluid motion, a sound that echoed with finality in the quiet of the study. I can't protect you from a chair, Silas, she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. If I go in there, we're just 2 rats in a high-tech cage waiting for them to find a way to smoke us out. Out here, I'm the ghost they aren't looking for. That's suicide. Silas yelled, stepping forward to grab her arm, to pull her into the reinforced tomb. You're a housekeeper, Simone. I don't know where you got that weapon, but these are professional hitters. They will tear you apart. Simone offered him a ghost of a smile, a cold, sharp thing that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a woman who had spent years cleaning up other people's messes, and was finally ready to make one of her own. I've been cleaning your house for 2 years, Mr. Vane. I know exactly where the shadows are. And I know exactly where Vargas' men are going to stand when they realize you're gone. She reached for the internal handle of the massive door. Simone, wait. Silas pleaded, a sudden sharp spike of fear hitting him, not for his own life, but at the prospect of the door closing on the only person who seemed to have a grip on reality. That's an order. Get in the vault. You aren't my commanding officer, Silas. And for the next hour, I'm not your maid. With a deceptive burst of strength, she shoved him back into the center of the room. Before he could lunge forward, she pulled the handle. The heavy titanium slab began to swing shut. Look at the monitors, she said, her voice barely a whisper as the gap narrowed. Watch what happens when you underestimate the help. The door sealed with a pressurized thunk that echoed like a coffin lid closing. Silas threw his weight against the cold metal, shouting her name, but the soundproofing was absolute. He was alone in the silence. Slowly he turned to the bank of screens. He saw the empty study on the primary feed, the red lights casting long, distorted shadows. Then he saw her. Simone didn't run. She didn't hide. She stepped into the center of the room, her back to the vault, and vanished into the darkness of the hallway just as the first shadow of an assassin's rifle rounded the corner. Silas Vane sat down in the velvet chair, his heart hammering against his ribs, and watched the silent monitors as his invisible girl prepared to go to war. Inside the vault, the silence was so thick it felt heavy, a pressurized vacuum that seemed to amplify the frantic thumping of Silas's own heart. He stood before the wall of monitors, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the console. The screens hummed with a cold electric life, casting a sickly teal and blue glow over his face. The video feeds were grainy, struggling against the interference of the penthouse's active jamming system, but they were clear enough to reveal a nightmare unfolding in high definition. Silas found the master joystick and cycled through the cameras. He bypassed the lobby, already littered with the bodies of his high-priced security team, and focused on the third-floor gallery. There, in the flickering strobes of the red emergency lights, he saw her. Simone moved through the frame like a glitch in the software. One moment she was a silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the shadows of a marble pillar. Silas watched, breathless, as a three-man stack of Lucien Vargas' elite hitmen entered the gallery. They moved with professional cohesion, rifles raised, infrared lasers cutting through the gloom like thin red wires. They were looking for a billionaire mob boss. They weren't looking for help. The lead assassin reached the center of the room when Simone reappeared. She didn't come from the side or the front. She seemed to drop from the very architecture of the room. Silas saw her blur into motion, a sudden violent eruption of competence. She didn't fire her weapon immediately. Instead, she used the magazine of her handgun to strike the first man in the throat before pivoting behind him, using his armored bulk as a human shield. The muffled thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire erupted on the monitor, though Silas heard nothing but the whine of the vault's ventilation. Muzzle flashes illuminated the grainy blue feed in sharp, jagged bursts. Simone was a whirlwind of black fabric and white apron, a domestic spectre turning the tools of her trade into instruments of execution. She moved with a frightening economy of motion. Her face, visible for a split second as she turned toward a camera, was a mask of absolute chilling neutrality. There was no fear, no hesitation, not even anger. There was only the hunt. Silas sank into the leather pilot's chair, his eyes fixed on the screen. He had spent decades dealing with the most dangerous men in the underworld, but he had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a brawl. It was a harvest. He watched as she dismantled the second team in the kitchen, using the very counter she had scrubbed that morning to vault over a hail of gunfire. She was using the penthouse against them, turning every corner she'd ever cleaned into a lethal ambush point. The graininess of the feed gave the footage a voyeuristic, haunting quality. It felt like watching a nature documentary where the prey had suddenly grown fangs. Silas realized then that the Varga problem he had been so worried about was being solved by a woman he had once ordered to fetch him a glass of water. He saw her pause by a fountain in the foyer, checking her peripheral before reloading with a crisp metallic snap he could almost feel through the glass. She looked up, her eyes seemingly locking onto the hidden lens of the camera Silas was monitoring. For a heartbeat, the master of the house and the maid shared a look through the digital veil. Silas felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He was safe behind a foot of reinforced titanium, but as he watched Simone disappear back into the darkness to find the remaining intruders, he realized the world he knew had ended. The woman on the screen wasn't his servant, and she never had been. She was a predator who had allowed him to live in her territory, and now he was simply the prize she was choosing to keep. The smell of lemon-scented floor wax and expensive bleach still hung in the air of the industrial-grade kitchen, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of gunpowder that was beginning to drift through the vents. Simone moved behind the long stainless steel island, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. She didn't look like a woman in the middle of a siege. She looked like someone preparing a meal, her movements steady and deliberate. The swinging double doors to the kitchen creaked open, the sound amplified by the silence of the penthouse. Two of Lucian Varga's men entered, their movements tactical and synchronized. They were encased in carbon fiber plating, their faces hidden behind matte black ballistic masks. They swept the room with their rifles, the red beams of their laser sights dancing across the industrial refrigerators and copper pots. To them, the kitchen was a transition zone, a service area meant for staff, not combatants. They never saw Simone until it was too late. She didn't lead with her firearm. As the first man passed the edge of the island, she reached out and grabbed the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet sitting on the range. With a fluid, whip-like motion, she brought it down on the side of his tactical helmet. The sound was a dull, sickening clunk that sent him staggering into the prep table. Before his partner could pivot, Simone launched a heavy crystal carafe she had been cleaning moments before. It shattered against the second man's visor, a spray of glass and water blinding him for the critical second she needed. Now she drew the Glock. The suppressed weapon coughed twice, two dry, rhythmic pulses. The first man, still dazed from the impact of the skillet, dropped before he could regain his footing. Simone didn't wait to watch him fall. She spun, using the momentum to kick the legs out from under the second assassin. As he hit the floor, his rifle clattering away across the tiles, he reached for a sidearm. Simone was faster. She stepped onto his wrist, the heel of her sensible work shoe pinning his hand to the floor with a localized pressure that snapped bone. She looked down at him through the teal-tinted gloom. The assassin stared back through his cracked visor, his eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing realization. He wasn't being killed by a bodyguard or a rival mobster. He was being dismantled by the woman who had likely poured his coffee at a diplomatic gala 6 months ago. "Varga sent the B team," she whispered, her voice a cold rasp that barely carried over the hum of the walk-in freezer. She fired once more. Silence reclaimed the kitchen, save for the hum of the appliances and the steady, rhythmic drip-drip-drip of a broken faucet. Simone didn't linger. She knelt by the fallen men, her fingers moving with surgical efficiency as she stripped them of their communication headsets and 2 flashbang grenades. She checked the seals on her apron, straightened the slight ruffle of her collar, and chambered a fresh round. On the monitors in the vault, Silas Vane watched the entire sequence in a state of shock that bordered on awe. He had seen professional hits before, but this was something else. It was domestic warfare. Simone hadn't just used the room. She had weaponized the very essence of her job. She moved past the bodies without a second glance, grabbing a clean microfiber cloth from the counter to wipe a stray smudge of blood from the slide of her weapon. She was no longer just a maid, and she was no longer just a soldier. She was a hybrid of both, a cleaner in every sense of the word. As she pushed back through the double doors and headed toward the main hall, the teal light of the kitchen caught the sharp, focused edge of her gaze. The first blood had been drawn, and the penthouse floor she had spent years keeping spotless was about to become a canvas of Varga's failure. Inside the vault, the air felt thin, or perhaps it was just the weight of the revelation unfolding on the screens. Silas Vane sat back in the leather chair, his eyes darting between the monitors and the auxiliary terminal built into the panic room's desk. On the main screen, Simone was moving through the darkened lounge, a fluid shadow that seemed to navigate the furniture by touch alone. She wasn't just hiding, she was clearing rooms with a tactical geometry that only elite military units understood. Silas pulled the keyboard toward him, his fingers flying over the keys. He was a man who prided himself on knowing every detail of his organization, from the shipping manifests in the harbor to the background of every soul who entered his penthouse. He pulled up the personnel files for the domestic staff, scrolling past the chefs and the drivers until he reached the entry for Gray Simone. The file was sparse. Too sparse. He clicked on her employment history. She had come to him through a high-end agency that had since folded, a detail he'd overlooked at the time. Her references were impeccable, but as he dug deeper, the digital trail began to dissolve. Her social security number was valid, yet it had no history before 10 years ago. Her previous addresses were P.O. boxes in cities where she had no recorded employment. There were no tax filings, no credit card statements, No digital footprint of a woman who supposedly lived a mundane life of service. "You're a ghost," Silas whispered, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his widening eyes. He accessed his deeper black market databases, the ones he used to vet rivals and high-level associates. He ran her facial profile from a high-resolution still he'd just captured on the kitchen camera. The software looped, scanning through international watch lists and military registries. Finally, the screen flashed a crimson warning. Access restricted. Level 5 clearance required. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't hired a maid. He had invited a wolf into his den. Simone Gray didn't exist. The woman outside that door was a masterpiece of deep-cover tradecraft. She had scrubbed his floors, polished his silverware, and overheard his most sensitive business calls, all while playing the part of a forgettable middle-aged servant. She knew his secrets, his weaknesses, and the exact layout of his fortress. On the screen, Simone paused in the hallway, tilting her head as if listening to a frequency Silas couldn't hear. She adjusted the headset she'd stripped from a dead assassin, her expression one of grim, professional focus. She looked less like a maid and more like the person who should have been leading the hit squad, not stopping them. A cold sweat broke out on Silas's forehead. He had spent 2 years treating her like an invisible piece of furniture, snapping his fingers for coffee and ignoring her presence while he discussed million-dollar betrayals. He had been completely vulnerable to her every single day. If she had wanted him dead, he would have been cold in the ground before he even finished his first cup of morning espresso. But she hadn't killed him. Instead, she was out there, risking everything to dismantle a Varga hit squad that was currently tearing his world apart. The irony was suffocating. He was protected by a woman whose very existence was a lie, a predator who had chosen his house as her sanctuary. He watched her melt back into the darkness of the master suite, her handgun lead lining her path. Silas Vane, the most feared man in the city's underworld, realized with a shudder that he wasn't the master of this penthouse. He was merely a guest in the hunting grounds of a woman he didn't even know. He leaned toward the screen, his pulse racing, finally understanding that the real danger wasn't Varga. It was the mystery currently bleeding for him in the hallway. The silence that followed the carnage in the kitchen was broken by a sound far more chilling than the alarm. The slow, rhythmic applause of leather gloves meeting in a cavernous hallway. Lucian Varga stepped into the light of the grand foyer, moving with the languid confidence of a man who owned the air he breathed. He wasn't dressed like his tactical team. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, his silver hair slicked back, looking more like a guest for a gala than a butcher come to collect a soul. "Silas!" Varga's voice was a smooth baritone that echoed off the high ceilings. "Come now, don't hide behind the steel. It's beneath you. Your guards were expensive, but ultimately quite brittle. Let's discuss the harbor terms like civilized men." He stopped at the base of the grand staircase, his eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't see the Mafia Boss. Instead, he saw a woman step out from behind a marble bust of a Roman emperor. She was still wearing the apron, though it was now splattered with the dark, jagged geometry of the night's work. She held her handgun in a low-ready position, her thumb resting casually over the safety. Varga tilted his head, a thin, amused smile touching his lips. "The maid. Truly, Silas. This is the last line of defense for the great Vane." "Silas isn't coming out, Lucian," Simone said. Her voice didn't shake. It was flat, carrying a resonant authority that caused Varga's smile to falter just a fraction. "And you aren't going to the harbor. You're going to leave through the same door you breached, or you're going to stay here permanently as part of the decor." Varga laughed, but his eyes were already cataloging her stance, the way her weight was distributed, the cold stillness of her barrel. He was a predator, and he recognized the scent of his own kind. "You have a very specific way of holding that Glock, darling." High tang, both eyes open, thumb over thumb. "That isn't something you learn from a YouTube video or a weekend at the range. It's something you learn when you've spent a decade hunting people who think a tailored coat makes them untouchable." Simone countered. She took a single step forward, into the flickering teal glow of the emergency lights. I know your type, Lucian. You're a ghost lead. You send the boys in first to soak up the lead. Then you walk in to take the credit when the room is cold. You're meticulous, arrogant, and you always carry a backup blade in your left sleeve because you don't trust your own aim under pressure. The air in the foyer seemed to drop 10 degrees. Varga's hand, which had been resting casually in his pocket, twitched. His amusement had vanished, replaced by a sharp, lethal curiosity. Who the hell are you? There are only 3 units in the world that teach that specific takedown sequence I saw in the kitchen. None of them involve domestic service. I'm the person who knows exactly how long it takes for your backup team to realize their comms are being looped, Simone said, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. You have 90 seconds before my proximity sensors go off. If you're still in this house at 91, I stop talking. Varga stared at her, his mind clearly racing through files of operatives, trying to place the face. For the first time that night, the lead assassin looked genuinely unsettled. He was used to being the most dangerous thing in the room, but looking at Simone, he realized he was staring at a veteran of a war he hadn't even been invited to. You're wasting your talent on a man like Vane, Varga whispered, his hand slowly moving toward his waist. And you're wasting your life on a job you can't finish, Simone replied. On the grainy monitor in the vault, Silas Vane watched the 2 predators circle one another, the audio feed picking up the low, dangerous hum of their exchange. He didn't understand the history they were speaking, but he understood the tension, the moment before the lightning strikes. The maid was standing her ground against the devil himself, and the devil looked like he was considering a retreat. The 90-second ultimatum expired not with a word, but with the sudden, violent fracture of the foyer's silence. Lucian Varga moved with the blurred speed of a viper, his tailored coat flaring behind him as he drew a compact submachine gun from beneath the silk lining. Simone was already mid-roll, her body a coiled spring of black and white fabric. The marble floor erupted in a line of white dust and sparks where she had stood a millisecond before, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of Varga's weapon chewing into the Roman busts. Simone fired back from a low crouch. Her Glock barked 3 times, the suppressed report sounding like heavy footsteps on a hollow floor. Varga dived behind a heavy oak pedestal, the red laser sights of his remaining backup team suddenly crisscrossing the hallway like a web of glowing wire. One of those red dots found Simone's shoulder. A sharp, searing heat tore through her deltoid as a high-velocity round grazed the flesh. Simone didn't scream, she didn't even gasp. She simply pivoted, her face a mask of frozen focus, and sent a single shot through the gap in the banister above. A heavy thud followed, the sound of a sniper falling from the mezzanine. Inside the vault, Silas was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the reinforced surface. The monitor feed was a chaotic strobe of teal shadows and orange muzzle flashes. He watched Simone crawl through the darkness of the hallway, her white apron now stained a deep, wet crimson. She was being hunted by the best in the business, cornered in the very hallway she had buffed to a mirror shine just hours ago. Varga stepped out from the shadows of the staircase, his confidence returning as he saw the blood on the floor. "You're leaking, darling," he called out, his voice echoing with a cruel metallic edge. "Even ghosts bleed. Why die for a man who doesn't even know your middle name?" Simone didn't answer. She was waiting for the rhythm. She knew Varga's type. He shot in bursts of 5, a habit from his days in the paramilitary. She counted the beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The moment the hammer clicked on an empty chamber, Simone surged forward. She didn't use her gun, she used her momentum. She tackled Varga right in front of the panic room's main viewing window, the 2 of them slamming against the reinforced glass with a bone-jarring impact that made Silas jump back. Silas stared, paralyzed, just inches away from the carnage. Through the glass he saw Simone's face, splattered with grit and blood, her eyes wide and terrifyingly bright. Varga had a knife out, the blade gleaming in the red emergency light as he drove it toward her ribs. Simone caught his wrist, her muscles straining against his weight. With a guttural roar, she slammed her forehead into Varga's nose, the sound of breaking cartilage audible even through the vault door. As Varga recoiled, Simone didn't hesitate. She didn't give him space to breathe. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive coat and spun him, driving him back against the marble pillar. She recovered her fallen weapon and, with a precision that was almost hypnotic, fired 2 rounds into his chest and a final, deciding shot into the floor beside him to signal the end of the war. Varga slumped, his silver hair no longer perfect, his life pooling on the floor she had kept spotless for 2 years. Simone stood over him, her chest heaving, the handgun still aimed at his head. She looked at the vault window, staring directly at Silas. She was wounded, exhausted, and covered in the filth of the underworld, but in that moment, she looked more like a queen than a servant. She reached up with a bloodied hand and tapped twice on the glass, the same way she used to signal when a room was clean and ready for him to enter. The duel was over. The penthouse was hers. The morning sun didn't just rise. It cut through the lingering smoke and the dust of pulverized marble like a surgical blade, illuminating the wreckage of the penthouse. The teal and orange shadows of the night had been replaced by a harsh, unforgiving white light. Silence had returned to the 58th floor, but it was no longer the rhythmic, domestic silence of a well-kept home. It was the heavy, echoing quiet of a graveyard. Inside the vault, the pressure hissed as the seal broke. Silas Vane stepped out into the hallway, his legs feeling heavy and uncertain. He didn't look like the city's most feared kingpin. His shirt was rumpled, his face pale from hours of watching a digital slaughter. He stepped over a spent casing and stopped. Simone was sitting on the edge of a mahogany bench in the foyer, her back against the wall. Her black uniform was torn, and the white apron was a ruin of crimson and soot. She was holding a clean cloth to her shoulder, her head tilted back, eyes closed. Her Glock lay on the bench beside her, the slide locked back on an empty chamber. She didn't open her eyes when he approached. She knew the sound of his shoes on the marble. For the first time in 2 years, Silas didn't see a maid. He didn't see someone whose job was to vanish. He saw the person who had held the line when his empire had turned to glass. He walked to the sideboard, but he didn't reach for the crystal decanter or ask for his morning espresso. He sat on the bench a respectful distance from her, looking out at the city skyline. "The agency said you were from a small town in Ohio," Silas said, his voice low and raspy. "They said your previous employer moved to Europe and didn't need you anymore. They said you were reliable, quiet, and invisible." Simone opened her eyes. They were still the eyes of the predator he had seen on the monitors, sharp, observant, and devoid of the feigned warmth of a servant. "The agency was paid very well to say exactly what I told them to say." Silas nodded slowly. He didn't look at the body of Lucian Varga, which was currently being bagged by a cleanup crew that had arrived minutes after the shooting stopped. He looked only at her. "I don't want a coffee, Simone. And I don't want the library locked." He turned to face her fully, his gaze intense. "I want your real name. I want to know who I've been living with for 700 days. Simone let the cloth fall from her shoulder, revealing a shallow, cauterized wound. She didn't flinch. "My name is Simone." That part was true. The rest is a life I burned down a long time ago. I was a cleaner, for a group that makes Varga look like a street thug. I wanted peace, Silas. I thought I could find it in the silver and the dust. "Peace is a lie for people like us," Silas replied. He stood up and reached into his pocket, pulling out a heavy gold-embossed keycard, not to the penthouse but to his private vault at the harbor. "You saved my life tonight. But more than that, you showed me that I've been blind. I've been looking for soldiers in the underworld, when the greatest warrior I've ever met was the one I ignored every morning." He held the card out to her. "I'm not going to ask you to go back to the kitchen. That life ended when you pulled that trigger. I'm moving against the rest of the Varga family, and after that, the Setties. I don't need someone to clean my floors, Simone. I need a partner. Someone who knows the shadows better than I do. Someone who can see the threats I'm too arrogant to notice. Simone looked at the card, then at the man who had finally learned to see her. The payoff wasn't just the money or the power. It was the end of the invisibility. I'm not a bodyguard, Silas, she said, her voice reclaiming its lethal edge. I know, he said, a small grim smile touching his lips. You're the ghost. And from now on, you're the only one who talks back to me. Simone reached out and took the card. The transition was complete. The maid was dead, and in her place stood a woman who no longer had to hide her teeth. As the city hummed to life below them, the master and the ghost walked together into the light of a very different day.